Hello everyone, welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 10. Today I'm reviewing The Birth of Korean Cool, How One Nation is Conquering the World Through Pop Culture by eunyhong. And it was first published back in 2014. eunyhong is an acclaimed journalist and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, as well as many other places. And several years before she published this book, she actually wrote a novel called Kept, a comedy of sex and manners, which I always meant to read, but just haven't gotten around to yet. A couple of years after Korean Cool, she wrote another non-fiction book called The Power of Nunchi, which I did read and thought was quite interesting and engaging, and I'll try and review that in a future episode. However, The Birth of Korean Cool, it's part memoir and part socio-cultural investigation into South Korea's rise to international cultural prominence through Hallyu, otherwise known as the Korean Wave. And it's a witty, insightful analysis of South Korean popular culture and its promotion of Korea on the world stage. Hong weaves her personal story together with the story of South Korea's recent modern history with a focus on cultural products, music, movies, TV, etc. When she was 12 years old, she moved from Chicago to Gangnam. This was in 1985. And as such, she says she was perfectly placed to observe South Korea's economic development, during which time it jumped from a third world military dictatorship to a first world liberal democracy on the cutting edge of global technology. Hong asks how South Korea became such an influential cultural powerhouse in business, technology, education and pop culture. It features lots of interviews and insightful analyses of various cultural trends. And as I'm sure you all know, Korean pop culture has only continued to expand its influence and rise in prominence since this book was published in 2014. We can point to BTS and K-pop in general as one example, and movies like Parasite as another example. As such, it's interesting to go back and see what this book has to say about Korean pop culture trends. So what was life like for a fully Americanized 12-year-old moving to Korea for the first time in the mid-1980s? In her introduction, Hong laments that, quote, Korea was not cool in 1985. So in 1985, she was uprooted by her family from Chicago and taken to Seoul. She was initially excited to escape America and leave behind classmates who would call her Ja or refuse to believe that she wasn't Chinese. But Hong was immediately shocked by the cultural differences and the accelerated pace of change she witnessed in the country around her. She memorably likens living in Seoul during this period of rapid development from the 1980s into the 90s as witnessing Rome being built in a day. So what does eunyhong have to say about the Korean Wave and its role in shaping the modern identity of Korea as an ultra-hip, technologically advanced country? These days, Hong notes, the picture is vastly different. South Korea is the world's 15th largest economy, Seoul is one of the most futuristic cities in the world, and Korean culture's cool cachet is on a seemingly unstoppable upward trajectory. Certainly the last few years have proven that trend. Hong details these changes at the same time as making the very compelling argument that it was all entirely by design. She writes that the Korean government, starting with Kim Dae-jung, quote, made the Korean Wave the nation's #1 priority. And she goes on to attribute much of the country's success to this enlightened government support and investment. That this includes wiring the entire country for high-speed broadband and creating a $1 billion investment fund in 2005 to promote the country's soft power in the form of music, film and TV dramas and various other things. Hong dedicates a chapter to each of these key Hallyu industries and has generally insightful, intelligent comments to make about each. She attributes much of the success of Hallyu to the concept of Han. In one of the book's most interesting chapters, she talks about Han, describing it as an arguably uniquely Korean feeling of sadness and resentment engendered by years of oppression and invasion. She says this was a prime motivating force behind South Korea's rapid growth transformation and global ambitions. As a side note, I perhaps should say that many argue that Han as a concept was a colonial invention of the Japanese when they ruled Korea in the first half of the 20th century. Hong, however, even suggests that Hallyu would not be possible without this foundation of Han. TV, dramas and movies have this as a kind of bedrock, this deep emotional well to draw from and be inspired by. She doesn't just talk about the country's development, she also tells her personal story. And so she has a lot of experiences as a teenager and adolescent in Seoul at that time in the late 80s and into the 90s. And one of the most interesting elements of the book are these personal anecdotes, memories and experiences that Hong weaves into the narrative. For an American teenager suddenly transplanted to Gangnam, life was complicated. She was mocked for her American accent, pressured to study, terrified of violent teachers, and struggled to fit in. Getting a good education in Korea was a harrowing experience with tutoring restrictions, hellish preparations for college exams, and a significant emphasis on iron-fisted teachers. Hong says she couldn't fully assimilate also due to attitudes against bilingualism. It's in describing these experiences that Hong's wry, ironic voice fully shines through, and it's this tone that makes The Birth of Korean Cool such a joy to read. The book also explores some tech-related angles. So there's a chapter about Samsung and how they became so successful. She writes that Samsung's strategy of having their products cover every price point while showcasing their high-end stuff effectively got their products into many hands and still does. The Birth of Korean Cool, it's not only a guide to South Korean culture, but also tries to be an examination of the Korean character. You'll probably find much to argue against or disagree with, but nevertheless, it's an interesting and worthwhile account of the rise of Korean popular culture.